On the 27th of October 1997, a rare object leaves the British Museum in London. Under tight security, it weaves its way through traffic and heads across town. To the casual observer, nothing seems out of the ordinary, but it is. At a nearby hospital, an Egyptian mummy is going in for a checkup, but the examination is far from routine. The coffin has never been opened. Now, its occupant will undergo a post-mortem for the first time in 2,000 years. In a special room of London's Throat, Nose and Ear Hospital, a mummy is about to be unwrapped, the high-tech way. The patient is a young man named Artemidorus. He looks like a Roman, but his coffin is Egyptian. He lived during the 2nd century AD when the Roman Empire ruled Egypt. In the past, unwrapping a mummy usually destroyed it, and conventional X-rays only exposed the skeleton. But the technique known as computer tomography, a CAT scan, is non-invasive. It slices through the body using a highly sensitive beam of radiation that reveals everything from bones and teeth to soft tissue. The result is a series of detailed cross-sections of the corpse. Today, Joyce Feiler, an expert in human remains at the British Museum, is getting her first look at the young man called Artemidorus.
What we have here is a view of the mummy. You can see the torso and the skull here. Over here, a cross-section, a slice, as if it was going through this part of the skull here. Round about the skull we have masses of amount of linen which were used to wrap up the body. Here is the skull. This is the nose, obviously the front area of the skull. And here is the back of the skull. You can see in here that the brain has obviously been removed. But what's really interesting about this skull are these cracks which you can see at the back of the skull.
When CAT scans are assembled and colorized by a computer, two-dimensional X-rays are transformed into dramatic three-dimensional images, revealing details never before seen. At the Institute of Laryngology and Otology at the University of London, where the images were compiled, Joyce Feiler and surgeon Gus Aluzzi are examining the mummy to see how Artemidorus was embalmed. The first glimpse of his body uncovered a shocking secret. His coffin may have been exquisite, but his mummy was a disgrace. Several of his bones are crushed or dislocated, and his spine is out of alignment.
In fact, when you look at the chest from the top, you can see that the ribs have been squashed in,
Yes.
leaving no room for any organs, which I presume have already been taken out.
His legs and feet are twisted, suggesting his body was manhandled. shoddy workmanship his embalmers thought would never come to light.
You can see the nose
Yeah.
quite clearly, and it seems that that's where they've put the packing through.
Yes, but quite interesting. Remember some of the other mummies we've looked at? There was packing in the skull, but there isn't in this one. So there's no sort of standard way of doing this, is
But
there?
they've still gone through the nose.
Yes.
All the way to the top of the nose, to the skull base, and then through the sinuses and into the brain. I presume that's how they took the brain out.
Artemidorus was one of the last Egyptians to be mummified. In the 3rd century AD, the spread of Christianity put an end to the age-old practice after some 3,000 years. Ironically, the art of preserving a body was held sacred, and the details of how to do it were never recorded by the Egyptians. The only account comes from the Greek traveller Herodotus, who visited Egypt in 450 BC. The chief priest, representing Anubis, the god of embalming, presided over the ritual while the appropriate spells were chanted. The first step was to prepare the spices, resins, and oils. Next, the brain was removed. Using a metal hook, it was drawn out through the nostrils. Hot oil, a combination of resin mixed with beeswax, was poured into the skull, where it eventually solidified. Next, an incision was made in the abdomen to take out the lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines. Here, timing was critical. Because of their high water content, internal organs are the first parts of a body to decompose. The organs were mummified separately. After drying, they were carefully washed and anointed with oil and resin. Then they were wrapped in linen and placed in one of 4 ritual canopic jars, inscribed with appeals to the gods, the 4 sons of Horus, for their protection. The heart was viewed as the seat of wisdom and left in place, while the kidneys were ignored, their importance not understood. Next, the body was packed with natron, a natural preservative consisting of a mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium chloride to draw the moisture out of the tissue. After 40 days, the natron was removed and the body anointed with oil and filled with linen to keep its shape. John Taylor, an expert on mummification from the British Museum, has evidence of the expertise of the embalmers.
This is an example of Egyptian embalming at its most sophisticated. The body of this elderly woman has been very carefully prepared, and you can tell that for a number of reasons. The hair is extremely well preserved. It would originally have been grey or white, but it's now been stained a reddish colour because of the resin which was applied to the entire surface of the body. The nose has retained its original shape, and this is an indication of the care of the embalmers. This is the incision which the embalmer made in the flank in order to extract the internal organs. The hands, and particularly the fingernails, are extremely well preserved. And this is another indication of the sophisticated techniques employed on embalming this particular lady. the fingernails have been held in position by winding very fine linen threads around each finger. And this is certainly not a feature of every mummy, and is an indication of the careful methods employed by her embalmers.
For the average Egyptian, it took 2 months' wages to be mummified, and 2 months more to pay for the mask. But at any cost, the price was worth it. The Egyptians believed a person's spirit survived after death, but it needed nourishment. If the body was unrecognizable, the spirit would go hungry and its afterlife would be in jeopardy. A mummy was an insurance policy against oblivion. As early as 4000 BC, Egypt's dead were buried in shallow graves in the desert. The hot, dry sand naturally withdrew moisture, preventing the growth of bacteria and decay. Later, as burials became more elaborate, corpses were put in deep chambers. But without the dry heat of the desert sand, decomposition set in. To preserve the body, the Egyptians borrowed from nature and developed the art of mummification. In 1997, a team of archaeologists led by Renee Friedman of the University of California at Berkeley were exploring a cemetery at Hierakonpolis, the ancient capital of Upper Egypt, when they came across some graves that were relatively undisturbed. Though most had been plundered in antiquity, the remains were in remarkably good condition. One, an adult female, aged 20 to 35, was still covered in matting and surrounded by 7 pots filled with food offerings. She died around 3500 BC, and her head, hands and arms had been wrapped in narrow strips of linen. Until now, the oldest known artificially preserved mummy dated back to 2950 BC. But the discovery of resin on the skin and linen of some of the bodies at Hierakonpolis suggests that the Egyptians were experimenting with the art of mummification some 500 years earlier than previously thought. In time, the technique would be perfected. At the Egyptian Museum in Cairo is the most extraordinary collection of mummies ever assembled in one room. Here lie 10 pharaohs from 3 dynasties spanning 500 years. As the rulers of Egypt, they received the best their embalmers had to give. Even in death, Thutmose IV looks like a king. His arms are carefully folded on his chest. His fingers are bent as if wrapped around a royal scepter. Seti I is over 3,000 years old. Despite a broken neck, his face still appears astonishingly lifelike and serene. It also retains the look of majesty befitting the powerful man he was. His son, Ramesses the Great, fathered 100 children and reigned for a lengthy 67 years, but his body reveals the torment of living with worn and abscessed teeth and a painful limp from arthritis of the hip. The body of Ramesses V is so well preserved, it even retains a rash of tiny sores attributed to smallpox, a deadly viral disease. The body of Egypt's most famous king, Tutankhamun, still lies in his tomb, sealed inside a gold coffin. Examination of his mummy in the 1970s revealed that his head isn't so well preserved, but X-rays of his skull have sparked a heated debate. Some Egyptologists claim he suffered a blow to the back of his head and may have been the victim of an assassination. Robert Connolly of the University of Liverpool conducted the original studies on Tutankhamun's X-rays.
One of the earliest suggestions was that the back of the head may have shown some injury or perhaps some thinning of the bone, suggesting a blow to the back of the head. You cannot see anything on this X-ray. There is no evidence, no real suggestion of a blow to the back of the head. Other people have suggested there may be some injury here around the ear. That is a perfectly normal appearance for the skull. The only fragment of bone which is out of place is there. And we know exactly where that came from. That came from a plate of bone here, which separates the nose from the brain cavity. And during mummification, when they removed the brain, this was done by fracturing this bone through the nose and removing the brain through the hole. And that fragment of bone there really should be there. And that is the only abnormality. There is absolutely no evidence on this X-ray suggesting cause of death.
But in the case of Artemidorus, evidence of violence is more obvious. While looking at the CAT scans, Joyce Feiler and Gus Alusi noticed several cracks radiating from what appears to be a wound on the back of his skull.
Chest from the top. You can see quite clearly some nice geometrical lines. Well, they're not nice because, in fact, these are, and if we can look at the back of the skull, you'll see that they're different from the normal sutures that you see inside the skull.
These lines, aren't they, here?
That's right.
Sort of wavy lines, which are quite normal, aren't they? And there doesn't seem to be any signs of healing, does it? They seem to be almost fresh, if I could say that.
That's right.
What do you
think?
think?
That must have happened very close to the time of death. May have even been the cause of death, judging by the other damage to the rest of the spine and the feet. It could have been part of the embalming process.
But I suppose if it was the embalmers, it would have to be quite a lot of damage,
Quite a brutal force.
Quite brutal damage.
It could have had a big knock on the head with a large, heavy object.
Yes.
Difficult to speculate.
Proverbial blunt instrument. Yes.
If the mummy was damaged during embalming, wrapping it covered a multitude of sins. The bandages were made of linen cut in strips of varying width. Some were specially woven, some came from fabric used in temple rituals, and some from simple household items such as clothes and bed sheets.
These are very interesting because it's possible to tell from these mummy wrappings what kind of object the cloth was originally used in. The woven blue borders on this piece are typical of the kind of decorative edging found on many Egyptian garments. On this piece, there is again a narrow border and also quite an extensive fringe. This may again have formed part of a garment or perhaps came from a bed sheet. And over here we have an example of a complete bed sheet, which is exactly the kind of thing which the embalmers used as the source of their cloth.
The torso was bandaged in layers several inches thick. The process took up to 2 weeks and consumed vast amounts of material. One mummy was wrapped in enough linen to stretch a half a mile. Between layers, amulets were secreted in specific locations around the body. Scores have been found on some mummies. Tutankhamun alone had 143, many crafted in gold. Some were images of the gods, others were symbols of eternity and strength. But the most important was a scarab beetle placed over the heart. Usually made of heavy green stone, it was a token of regeneration. A spell written on the back assured its owner his heart would not betray him on the day of judgment. "O my heart, which I had from my mother, do not stand up as a witness against me," begs the deceased. The importance of the heart is vividly illustrated in the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells Egyptians took with them to the grave to help them over the hurdle of Judgment Day. Brought before 42 judges, the deceased had to prove his right to be admitted into paradise. Based on the belief that to know their names was to control them, spell number 125 contained detailed instructions on how to address each of the judges. "I know you, and I know your name. Lord of Truth is your name," announces the deceased. Next comes a declaration of innocence of 42 terrible crimes. All the while the heart is weighed against the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth. The jackal, Anubis, guardian of the underworld, checks the balance, while Thoth, the ibis-headed god of knowledge and truth, prepares to record the result. The monster Amit, part crocodile, part lion, and part hippopotamus, looks on, ready to swallow the heart laden with sin. If the deceased is found worthy, Horus presents him to his father, Osiris, the lord of the underworld. Now immortal, a mask of everlasting gold placed over the face will help guarantee eternal life. The word mummy comes from the Arabic word mumia, a black pitch-like substance known as bitumen, found in the Near East and believed to contain healing powers. When the Arabs saw their first Egyptian mummies, blackened by embalming oil, they thought they'd found a substitute for bitumen and ground them up for medicine. But it was Napoleon's ill-fated expedition to Egypt in 1798 that would arouse a passion abroad for anything Egyptian, especially mummies. Lured by the lucrative market in Egyptian artifacts, an Italian adventurer, Giovanni Battista Belzoni, sought his fortune excavating monuments and tombs. In a published account of his discoveries, he noted the astonishing number of corpses in the tombs surrounding ancient Thebes. "Every step I took, I crushed a mummy in some place or another. Thus I proceeded from one cave to another, all full of mummies piled in various ways, some standing, some lying, and some on their heads. By the 19th century, mummies were so popular, it was not unusual for a gentleman on a tour of Egypt to return home with a corpse for a souvenir. Then an invitation would go out to his friends, a mummy from Thebes to be unrolled at 2:30, one read.
That'll be a surprise for this afternoon.
Did you enter the tombs then?
Yes, we did. All the crew went to the tomb.
After a fine meal, the high point of the afternoon would come. The mummy would be unwrapped.
Now I have you a surprise, shall we?
Even if it was a sacrilege, audiences were enthralled at the prospect of gazing on the shriveled face of an ancient Egyptian from the time of the pharaohs. During the Industrial Revolution, Americans were even less sentimental and far more practical when it came to mummies. An audacious entrepreneur, Augustus Stanwood of Maine, manufactured paper from their linen bandages when there was a shortage of rags in the United States. Stanwood was able to import tons of mummies for less than 3 cents a pound, half the price of rags at home. But because the linen was discolored by embalming oils, the paper came out brown and was only suitable for meat wrapping. Production was halted when a cholera epidemic broke out, claiming among its victims the rag pickers and cutters of Stanwood's mill. The outbreak was perceived by some as the curse of the dead, but the tradition of brown paper in meat markets can still be found today. Perhaps the most shameful exploitation of Egypt's legacy was the use of mummies for firewood. In his book, Innocents Abroad, Mark Twain describes watching stokers shoveling mummies into the furnace of a steam engine when an engineer shouted, "Damn these plebeians, they don't burn worth a cent. Pass out a king." But the fodder for one man's joke was a source of inspiration to another. A British physician named Augustus Granville began his career specializing in the diseases of women and children. It struck him that mummies were an invaluable source of medical information if only they could be scientifically examined. On a mummy given to him in 1821, he performed the first real autopsy on an ancient Egyptian. From it, he was able to determine that the patient, a woman, had died in her 50s, perhaps of ovarian cancer, the oldest known case in history. Following Granville, Egyptologists took increasing interest in the scientific value of mummies. Today, Egyptian mummies are still contributing to medical science in ways never before envisioned. At the Royal Infirmary in Manchester, England, an anonymous female mummy christened 1766 is being prepped for a unique study. Looking on is Rosalie David, one of the foremost authorities on mummies and ancient diseases. Today, as part of the famed Manchester Mummy Project, 1766 is being examined for the first time using one of the most powerful X-ray machines available. Her exquisite coffin is gilded and inlaid with semi-precious stones. But what's inside is far more valuable to medical science. Using a technique called endoscopy, a tiny camera is inserted into the mummy through an opening in the bandages, and its progress tracked on a video monitor.
There's the packaging at the top. Now it's this side I need to stay.
You're on the left now.
This was really a breakthrough which the Manchester team pioneered back in the mid-80s, because it means that we are virtually non-destructive in our examination of the mummies and in being able to take samples which can then be studied.
To avoid contamination from packing materials and centuries of environmental pollutants, the tissue sample is taken from deep within the body. Tissue samples are vital to studies of ancient diseases, but today the team is also launching a long-term investigation into the use of pain-killing drugs in ancient Egypt. Although 1766's gilded mask suggests she was from a rich family, she may have contracted a painful and ultimately fatal parasitic disease. If so, drugs may have been given to her to alleviate her suffering. While their existence has not been proven, plants such as poppies have appeared in tomb paintings throughout Egypt, hinting that drugs like opium may have been used much earlier than ever believed. Special vessels resembling poppies have also been identified as opium holders, suggesting that opium was widely traded. The possibility that the Egyptians may have used drugs as painkillers intrigues anesthesiologist Dave Council, a consultant to the Manchester Mummy Project.
It's quite clear that drugs such as opium were in widespread use at around the time of Christ. There's written evidence describing opium, the harvesting of opium, its use as a painkiller, and indeed the side effects and problems of addiction due to opium. But what we don't know is how it was used before the time of Christ. By sampling human remains from various periods of history, we hope that we can identify when these drugs were introduced into usage and really push back the history of these drugs, perhaps as far back as 3000 BC, if not earlier.
Drugs which have been ingested leave chemical fingerprints in a body. To find them, the tissue sample is being reduced to a liquid, then a gas, for analysis by a mass spectrometer, which will determine its chemical composition. If any narcotics are present, even minute proportions will be detected. The technique can also determine if drugs were administered while 1766 was alive, or whether they are byproducts of the mummification process.
The drugs we'd be particularly interested in are the strong, powerful plant-based drugs that we still in fact use in modern medicine today. Drugs such as morphine and codeine, which are both powerful painkillers and both derived from the opium poppy. We'd be interested in cannabis, which we know comes from the hemp plant and which we know was around in ancient Egypt as far back as 3000 BC, because we know they were making ropes.
While the verdict is not yet in on drugs in the ancient world, mummies will soon be entering another exciting new realm of science. Locked inside them are priceless fragments of DNA, each containing potential clues to the origin of a deadly disease. Researchers hope that by tracing their evolution, they may find antidotes for malaria and hepatitis, and these ancient killers could one day be eradicated. The making of a mummy was only the first step in the quest for eternity. The funeral followed a fixed sequence of events, beginning with a procession from the family home. For a real send-off, professional mourners streaked with dust were hired to pull their hair and clothes. Next came servants carrying the dead's personal possessions. Until now, the body was still considered an empty shell. To restore its senses and bring it back to life, the most important ritual was the opening of the mouth ceremony. A papyrus in the British Museum shows a priest wearing the mask of Anubis, holding up a mummy. The jars represent cleansing. The adze was used to touch the eyes, ears, mouth and nose of the mummy. Symbolically opening each of the senses brought the body back to life. Finally, the coffin was placed in the burial chamber and the tomb sealed. In Egyptian tomb paintings, their owners and their families usually appear healthy and in the prime of life. But their servants and ordinary workmen appear with a wide variety of ailments, reflecting the harsh realities of life. For the past 3 years, Margaret Judd of the Sudan Archaeological Research Society has been exploring a cemetery in northern Sudan to find out how the dead really lived. So far, she's excavated several burials located near one of Egypt's trade routes to Central Africa. Their bones and teeth confirm that the life of a trader was not always easy.
This individual here is a young male, approximately 25 years of age. And you can see that the teeth are abraded, which is due to cultural practice. That can be caused by the diet or an alternative use of the teeth as a tool. There are very few cavities in these individuals, although this one does have a slight abscess right in the lower left mandible.
Part of the problem was sand. In the desert, sand got into everything, including the most common staple, bread. A steady diet of sand could wear away even the strongest teeth in no time. But his teeth were not his only problem.
The individual also has a couple fractures. The right forearm is fractured. There's a midshaft fracture to the ulna and radius, which is often due to fending off a blow. The ulna did not heal properly. The radius, however, is perfectly healed. The lower leg also has a healed fracture. It's the left fibula and tibia, and the fracture has fused upon healing. And because the fibula isn't necessary for transportation, the individual probably did not have any problem walking at all.
One of the most extensive collections of ancient Egyptian human remains is kept at the Medical School of Cairo University.
Roxy, here are your bones.
Roxy Walker of the Bioanthropology Foundation has been examining the skeletons of two females, one a commoner and one a queen. Just by looking at their bones, she can tell who's who.
4,000 years ago, this young woman lived and walked on the banks of the Nile. She led a hard life, dying at the relatively tender age of about 20. And we can see this by looking at such indicators as the extreme wear on her teeth. We see from her vertebrae that she had early arthritic changes. This is consistent with both carrying heavy burdens and with leaning over and painfully grinding grain. If we look at the bones of her upper arm, we see that the circumference is pretty robust, and there are several ridges where her upper arm muscles were actually attached. With this young woman, who died perhaps 18 months to 2 years younger, and you see, comparing the two left humeri, how this one is much more gracile or graceful. Indeed, her hand is slender, refined, with beautifully manicured nails stained red with henna.
The identity of the first woman is unknown, but the name of the second is Queen Ashait. Her hair was beautifully prepared. Scenes show the hair of such queens being carefully dressed by a servant. Hair was a major preoccupation of the elite. A common affliction in ancient Egypt was head lice. Contrary to popular belief, lice are not the product of poor hygiene. They only live on shafts of clean, healthy hair attached to the scalp. The frequency of lice suggests the Egyptians washed their hair routinely. To prevent an infestation, some relied on regular combing and the use of oils. Others cropped their hair and wore wigs. Wigs were equally popular with men and women who valued them as status symbols. With a wide range of styles to choose from, the Egyptians changed wigs like hats. One of the most elaborate was a double wig consisting of two separate sections, waves or curls for the top of the head, and braids worn over the shoulders. Joanne Fletcher of Manchester University has made a career studying ancient tresses. She's found that when it comes to hair, the Egyptians had a lock-on style.
Here we have possibly the most wonderful hair remains from the whole of ancient Egyptian civilization. We have the hair of a couple that lived around 3,500 years ago. This is the hair of a young man who died around the age of 30 to 35. And then the very best piece, this is the hair of his wife, who died rather later, aged around 55 to 60 years of age. And we can see from the top section her natural hair, quite fine. She was obviously going quite grey towards the end of her life. And the hairdressers, as a post-mortem addition, had actually woven in false hair, human hair extensions, which were braided in very, very carefully. The style itself represents a very ornate, distinctly artificial style, the so-called Hathor style.
The lady in question worked hard to look her best in the afterlife. Her hair, a mass of false braids and curls, was copied from sculptures of Hathor, the goddess of beauty. The curls were worn over the chest and held in place with a setting lotion made of beeswax. The attention paid to hair was as crucial in death as it was in life. An Egyptian's final appearance on Earth was the prelude to eternity. Though looks were no guarantee of immortality, some would achieve it in a most unusual way. Today, one of the British Museum's prized possessions, the 2,000-year-old mummy of Artemidorus, is coming back to life. Now that his post-mortem is complete, the museum is anxious to see if the face on his coffin is an idealized portrait or a true representation of the young Egyptian. To find out, João Campos of the Institute of Laryngology and Otology, University of London, is combining his knowledge of human anatomy with computer technology to reconstruct a likeness.
We start with a three-dimensional model of the skull of the mummy, which we got from the CT scans. And based on that model, we identify a series of landmark points. Then we add the soft tissue thickness to each one of these points, because they vary according to the location. To give a more realistic view, what we do is we map the portrait that we got from the case of the mummy. We map that portrait into the reconstructed face. So we have the real texture of the eyes and the eyebrows and the lips and the skin. And the result is a very realistic view of the face.
It seems the real Artemidorus had lost the blush of youth. His face appears fuller and more robust. Clearly, the artist thought his image could be improved. In the past 2 decades, mummies like Artemidorus have been X-rayed, probed, autopsied, and analyzed to satisfy our curiosity about the ancient Egyptians. Now, in an extraordinary turnabout, modern physicians are enlisting the aid of ancient mummies to help save time and lives. Gessaluzzi specializes in ear surgery, a procedure that's both dangerous and tricky. Because of the possibility of damaging the delicate bones in the skull, he's been exploring a novel way to improve the odds.
We've been investigating ways in which we can minimize the amount of risk associated with this type of surgery, improve the safety, and reduce the amount of time that it takes to perform the surgery. In order to do that, we've looked at a variety of ways, one of which is the applications of virtual reality in surgery.
The realm of virtual reality is entered through a graphic 3-dimensional image of a mummy's skull. For the first time, CAT scans like this allow physicians to explore the inner landscape of the ear in detail and plot their procedures before surgery.
This kind of data cannot be just taken from existing scans on patients, because the amount of radiation involved to produce such good quality images would have meant a very large dose of radiation.
The greater the dose of radiation, the more detailed the images, but also the higher the risk of harming living tissue. To get the best pictures without injuring patients, hospitals are using mummies to calibrate their CAT scanners. For Yolanda Sykes and her son Christopher, a visit to the British Museum in London is more than a day's outing. Although he doesn't know it yet, Christopher is about to come face to face with an old friend. During a previous pregnancy, his mother developed a condition called pre-eclampsia, which can cause stunted growth of the fetus. When Christopher came along, doctors at St. Thomas's Hospital decided to keep an eye on him in the womb, using a technique they pioneered to scan mummies for the museum, but this time modified for an ultrasound machine.
Her eyes. Hey, can you see her eyes?
The technique was perfected on an Egyptian priestess nicknamed Jenny.
When you were a baby in my tummy, at the hospital they took special pictures of you in my tummy, and they used that same machine to make the pictures. They used it on Jenny. And how old are you, Christopher? So nearly 3. Well, Jenny's 3,000 years old. And you see beautiful pictures on her.
Christopher is healthy and happy thanks to Jenny, the mummy who reached across time to share the gift of life.
And where her ears. Show me.
There?
Yeah.
There?
And she thinks she's got an ear around the other side?
Yeah.
Yeah. And her hair, she got stripy hair at the top.
Today, mummies are no longer exotic curiosities, monsters of legend, or even simple works of art. Today, the dead stand with the living on the threshold of the future. For an ancient Egyptian seeking immortality, what more could be bliss?